The process of communication, the lifeblood of every school. Communication is a process that links the individual, the group, and the organization. On this slide, we see a Venn diagram demonstrating that these three entities, although individualized, do overlap. It's essential for all school leaders to understand that it's through effective communication that relationships are built, trust is established, and respect is gained. Without effective communication, all of these areas are very difficult to foster and manage. In 1974, Guarino said, "In areas of leadership, there is no talent more essential than one's ability to communicate." Can you think of a time in your career or even your personal life when communication, or the lack thereof, was the make or break for a situation? When did communication come into play in your professional career? If it's true that any activity that conveys a message between individuals is considered communication, we must understand that there is both verbal communication and nonverbal communication. How often have you heard someone and watched as they behave differently than their words might convey? If communication involves the exchange of information between a sender and a receiver, it's very important that the sender be very clear and that the receiver be open to the understanding of what is trying to be conveyed. How many times can you think of that arguments occurred because either the communicator, or the sender, was not clear, or the receiver just couldn't understand what the communicator was trying to communicate? So now we come to the process of communication. A sender transmits a message. The message is received by the receiver. While all of that is happening, the receiver is trying to decode the words of the sender through their own past experiences, knowledge, values, and prior observations, and make some meaning of the words that they hear, and hopefully they're providing feedback to the sender. So all of this is happening on the receiving end as the sender continues to transmit their message. It's no wonder that communication can sometimes become garbled if we don't understand the process. If we've experienced effective communication, it means that there is a mutual sharing of ideas and feelings out of which understanding develops and action is taken. If the communication was not effective, the result will not be what was hoped for. If meaning is not in the actually spoken word, but rather in the mind of the receiver, it's very, very important that the communicator know one's audience. And this is something that we have gone through in the last several lessons, knowing your community, knowing your audience, and understanding how they will take meaning from what you communicate. If it's true that the receiver gives meaning to messages based on background knowledge, experience, values, and prior observations, and that the sender must strive to transmit the message using symbols familiar to the receiver, we truly have to know to whom we're speaking. A message may be delivered in one way to educational staff who understand the jargon of the educational process. And believe me, we do have a lot of jargon in education, a lot of acronyms. If we try to use that same jargon and those same acronyms with our parent community, they can very easily be lost and not understand the meaning of our message at all. The following diagram shows us the factors influencing meaning in a slightly more organized fashion. Each are equal value. The greater the agreement between the sender and the receiver regarding the symbols used, the greater the probability of understanding occurring between the two parties. Let's go back to our educational example. If you were a principal and you were speaking to your teachers about SGOs, PARCC scores, and DRA results, they would probably, if they were elementary teachers especially, understand exactly what you were talking about. But try using PARCC scores, SGOs, and DRA results in a conversation with your parent community, and most, if not all of them, would be unfamiliar with at least two of those three examples. So to reiterate, it's crucial that we develop an understanding of the individuals to whom we are communicating, acknowledge the receiver's frame of reference, be sensitive to cultural differences, obtain feedback from those with whom we communicate, and always remember to appeal to the human element. Because communication is a two-way activity, it's important to become an active listener, to be attentive to both the content of the message and the feelings of the sender, and to view communication as a people process rather than a language process. It's critical to remember that barriers can interfere with the effectiveness of the transmittal process and cause a breakdown in communication, reducing the agreement that exists between the sender and the receiver. Some of these barriers can include information overload, which is too much information sent before understanding can be developed, status of differences, semantics, interpersonal relations, the way people filter messaging, and paralanguage. It's very important for leaders to have a plan that can be used to reduce these barriers to effective communication. In other words, plan ahead and think about the potential barriers that could occur before they actually happen. It's important to have a plan to reduce the communication barriers that could occur. Some of these include establishing effective interpersonal relationships, managing position power, being an active listener, acquiring feedback, displaying empathy, and applying ethics to the conversation. A critical lesson for all school leaders to understand that in schools, for communication to be as effective as possible, the act of receiving information must be separated from the act of judging information. If we are too quick to judge and don't have time to consider the information that we have received, our actions may not fit the activity that needs to occur. It's clear to see that the lack of communication effectiveness can become a roadblock to total school effectiveness. If our messaging is weak or poor, the activities that we expect to accomplish will most likely not happen or take much longer to occur than we had anticipated. Now we come to an element of the communication process that is very frequently overlooked, and that is the assessment of that process of communication. Evaluation is a vital step in community relations. Public attitude is difficult to measure. However, school officials need to attempt to measure effectiveness of their communications, and communication should be an investment that helps the mission that you are trying to accomplish. A nuance of this assessment means that we must not only assess direct communication, those specific messages that we actively communicate through words, but also the indirect communication, what we communicate by our actions. A school may say they value every student, and yet in some of the processes or activities that in which a school engages, it may not support those words. And so we have to assess exactly what we are acting upon in addition to the words that we communicate. Through the assessment process, we have to be careful that we don't make some assumptions that could mislead our results. For example, don't equate the dissemination of the communication and the effort that's put out to equate that with the results that we get and to expect that that will be the same might be misleading. We have to be careful about the samples and the sample size. Are they representative of the communication audience and intent? Does increased knowledge mean more favorable attitudes from our recipients? And everything positive is measured in large numbers. That may not always be true. So some of those truths that we may assume are truths are actually more assumption than fact. So although in public schools especially, we really don't think about this, but there is a need to have a public relations plan in place. As we talked about the assessment of communication, the purpose of its evaluation, number one, is to improve the communications themselves, to determine, number two, if our communications are actually achieving the results we anticipated. Three, are those results worth the time and money that's put out? And lastly, do those communications bring greater visibility to our accomplishments? All of those things should be part of that evaluation process. So part of the activity that really needs to go on that will help us assess our communications might include to do some pre-research. Look at our publications and our communications and look at the audiences for whom they're intended. Make sure that there's an alignment between those two things. After we do our communication research, some of the questions we might ask ourselves are, how well was the message received? Was the message read? Did our audience understand the message? Lastly, I leave you with some examples of ways that we could evaluate our communications. That might be through observation, through the collection of records and data, through surveys, through checklists, rating scales, and opinion polls. As I said earlier, it's extremely important that we go back to our constituents to see that our messaging has met them the way that we had intended it to. The following slide shows references that were used during this presentation's composition.